Right, everyone, let's make a start. I've taken over as chair for this afternoon, and sorry, I've been running up and down the stairs to get to get a laptop cord. It's my pleasure to introduce the final All Souls seminar of this term, the second in our mini seminar series on punishment and art. And our speaker today is Anna Chamberlen from the University of Warwick, where she is Associate Professor of Sociology. Anna's interests lie in the field of theoretical criminology, sociology of punishment, sociology of emotions, and she's author of Embodying Punishment, which came out in the Oxford University Press's Clarendon series. And she's going to talk to us today on the subject of the title of Prison's Palette, Theorising the Relationship Between Punishment and Art. So I'm looking forward to this immensely. And without further ado, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks, Mary, for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. So I'm going to share my screen. If I manage to do this, there we go. Can you all see that? Yeah. So I've slightly changed the title since I last gave an update on this talk. So I've called it Artful Punishment, the Curious Symbiosis Between Art and Imprisonment. And this is really a kind of a work in progress. It's a project that is very much at its embryonic stages, and it started off kind of in a somewhat unorthodox manner after I had finished my PhD, where, as Ian briefly mentioned, I looked at the embodied experiences of imprisonment among women, prisoners in particular. I kind of engaged through coincidence and accident in some regards with various prison artists, especially former prisoner artists. And I engaged with them as a way to, as part of an attempt to communicate the findings of that study on the embodied experiences of imprisonment. So I organized a series of events as part of this so-called public engagement and impact activities that we are all now kind of encouraged to pursue in universities. And in that process, in those activities, I came to kind of see in practice the affective impact that the arts have in kind of changing a lot of the time public sentiments, or at least in engaging the public in issues of crime and justice. So I kind of started thinking about the relationship between the arts and punishment, first and foremost, in terms of how the arts might pose a method or a medium for us to politically challenge our carceral obsessions, and potentially consider how the arts might act as both a way to do a sociology of punishment, but also as a way to do a kind of activist politics around the problems of punishment. And in these engagements that I can talk to you a bit more about in the discussion if you want to, where I organize a series of events with a group of different artists and different arts practitioners working in the prison sector, what kind of got me very interested in this relationship between the arts and prison was the fact that I could see constantly, both in the art of the artists, but also in the kind of the interactions between artists and practitioners and facilitators of these arts programs, I could see a tension between the role of the arts in these people's lives and the role of punishment. And that tension also kind of defines my own perspective on this relationship. So this paper that I will present today is largely an attempt for me to deal with my own ambivalences, I suppose, with the ambivalences I have in relation to the prison arts. I'm trying to basically locate and take a position on how I see the prison arts featuring in the lives of artists in prison, but also in the lives of prison artists after prison, but also what I see their role to be for us as audiences and spectators. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to read some of this just as a way of focusing a bit the discussion. So in this paper, I propose a framework for analyzing and critically utilizing the relationship between the arts. And here I'm thinking about kind of an all-inclusive conceptualization of the arts to incorporate music, drama, writing, and the visual arts, and how this relate to imprisonment. Specifically in the paper, I argue that in order to understand the role and impact that the prison arts have on the institutions that host them, on the artists that create them, and their audiences beyond prison walls, it's important to frame art and punishment in the carceral context as coexisting in a complex, dynamic, often contradictory, but curiously symbiotic relationship. I argue that this is a relatively unexplored relationship, which has also been under-theorized in both criminology and in the arts disciplines. And in this paper, I provide some initial reflections about how we might craft the theory of this relationship. So the paper seeks to show that one of the most powerful reasons for pursuing a more holistic and concentrated effort to understand the infiltration of the arts into the prison world is because they can offer a unique means through which to study and better appreciate both the lived experiences of the pains of imprisonment and the coping strategies associated with surviving punishment. And by extension, they can potentially enable a more meaningful avenue through which to study identities, biographies, and the emotions of prison artists. This can contribute also towards an effort to humanize the discourse around contemporary penal subjects, and such a study can also add a deeper layer of understanding on the emotional fiber of prison life, the struggles associated with it, and it can also highlight unique expressions of resistance that such experiences may enable. Moreover, I suggest that although it's a challenge that poses several risks, we can also consider the promise of the prison arts, and by drawing on cultural artifacts and imagery of the prison and its experience, the prison arts can effectively inform public and social understandings of the inmate world, and therefore they can potentially challenge more collectively our carceral obsessions. So these are the research questions that I engage with in this particular paper, and more generally in the project, I'm interested in basically seeing how we might use the prison arts as a way to better understand or differently understand the experiences of punishment. And I'm also interested in kind of designing ways of reading this prison art as potential forms of data. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm looking at these three questions here on the slide, and I will start the paper, the discussion today, by looking at the links between prison and art, and consider a little bit the context in which this relationship has been studied from both a criminological and prison studies perspective, as well as from the arts side of things as well. And then the second question I will be looking at explores how we might basically theorize this relationship, and what are some of these methodological considerations we might want to take into account when doing so. So I propose that a theoretical avenue to curate this relationship between arts and punishment might rely on the kind of the common thread between the two, being what I consider to be an embodied focus on the notion of pain in the prison context, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on. Finally, the third question asks about this political utility about the prison arts, and basically this is where I explore how and whether we might realistically be able to use the role of the prison arts in doing not only scholarship but also a more activist kind of politics focus on anti-carceral agendas. So starting off with a little bit of context then. So prison art as a concept has a long history. Probably, I mean, it's fair to say, I think, that we can identify examples of prison art as you know, as early as prisons have kind of emerged, historically speaking. But most of those histories are more evident in historiographical accounts of punishment itself rather than art histories. I will come back to the issue of the art histories later on, but in those stories, in those histories of punishment, it's fair to say that there is a consensus in the literature that, especially in the last 50 or so years, this literature suggests that we have seen a flourishing of arts in the criminal justice arena, which has been consolidated by various arts programs being run in prisons by prison educators, but also by other organizations that bring into the prison various forms of training and workshops and other kinds of projects. So examples of this kind of non-prisoner arts collaborations include, as you had even in this series a couple of weeks ago, the Artists in Residence programs available in prisons like HMP Grandin. But arguably the most concrete exemplification of the proliferation of the arts in prisons in recent decades can be seen through the very diverse range of arts programs and art therapy programs available today inside prisons. So these kinds of programs are very popular among the prisoners and among their facilitators, of course. And it's within these programs that often the charity and voluntary organizations that offer them have sought to consolidate their role as key actors, I would say, in the delivery of rehabilitation in custody. Despite the prevalence of a punitive law and order approach in many of our contemporary criminal justice systems, including that of England and Wales, in recent years we have witnessed a return of this rhetoric on rehabilitation in prisons. And it's been coupled with a broader neoliberal stance supporting the use of a so-called empowering set of strategies in custodial settings. So these kinds of rhetorics perform probably an ambivalent role where principles of care and therapy have been co-opted in attempting to individualize and minimize delinquency in these individualizing forms. Therefore, they're acting primarily in the name of desistance. The delivery of arts training, education, and arts engagement opportunities sit largely within this rhetoric of rehabilitation focused on desistance. And it's maintained by a large number of theater, writing, visual arts, music, and other creative practices organizations. This include, for example, some of organizations who have a very long-standing kind of reputation in the sector, who have been around for several decades, especially theater companies like Clean Break, Giz Theater, and Synergy, as well as the very established charities in the visual arts sector in prisons, especially Coaster Arts. So the numbers of organizations involved in arts provision is also increasing in recent years. And the National Criminal Justice Arts Alliance reports that they're promoting over 900 individuals and voluntary organizations developing these arts-based services in and out of prison. The Arts Alliance, the Arts Criminal Justice Arts Alliance, also hosts an impressive archive of various research evaluations showing the mostly positive outcomes of a range of their arts programs. And it's very easy to identify several different examples on their site, including the most recent ones I saw of evaluation programs of a music program offered by the Irene Taylor Trust called Sounding Out, a dance and performance pilot that was focused on vulnerable prisoners and was offered by Odd Arts Company and Company Chameleon, as well as most recently a fashion traineeship and workshop called Making Change that was offered by the London College of Fashion. So many member organizations of the National Criminal Justice Arts Alliance, including Safe Ground, which is one of the organizations I've worked with quite closely in organizing some of these public engagement events I mentioned earlier, they have done some impressive work in promoting and enabling opportunities for prisoners to learn to anchor their creativities. They have helped them facilitate and kind of learn different skills and use different art forms in order to enable expression and coping with their experiences, not only of punishment, but also of their previous experiences related to their offending and marginalization. And many of these organizations at the moment are also playing kind of a double role, acting as both facilitators of these arts programs, as teachers or as tutors in these programs, as well as advocates for prisoners in the outside, especially in the arts and academic communities. So they kind of take a bit of an activist role as part of their arts provisions roles. Some of the arts programs offered in prisons deliberately draw on art therapy. And this is an approach that became especially popular in the US and has recently, more recently, kind of become consolidated here in the UK too. So the British Association of Art Therapists defined this as a form of psychotherapy that uses art media as its primary mode of expression and communication. Within this context, art is not used as a diagnostic tool, but as a medium to address emotional issues, which may be confusing and distressing. So such therapies range from dance movement therapy, drama therapy, visual arts therapy, and musical therapy. And these programs have been developed by, again, voluntary organizations and volunteer prison visitors mostly, who in many regards have now again, consolidated their role as the main providers of therapeutic interventions on behalf of prison authorities. The rationale and broader narrative around many of their therapeutic programs focus on what is perceived to be the healing power of creative expression and the empathetic nature of art, enabling skills that are deemed to be indirectly associated with desistance from offending. So in these evaluation reports of arts programs, you will often see references to the notion of self-esteem and confidence, and things around diversion from anger and violence-based communication. And these are seen to be metrics or factors associated potentially or indirectly with desistance from offending. So even in the literature that has engaged with the relationship between this arts provision and prison, what we have seen is, as Leo Heliotis has noted, we have seen a prioritizing of the efforts focused on this development of a practitioner-run prison kind of art culture. And these kinds of courses that are prioritized or emphasized in the literature are the ones that claim to empower and rehabilitate prisoners, assuming and establishing in the literature, perhaps we might say, the murky and probably a rather instrumental connection between the art's positive impacts and prisoner rehabilitation and reintegration. So there have been several consequences as a result of this kind of treatment of the relationship between the arts and prison. One of which is that scholarship has remained, I would say, rather silent on artistic expression independent of the prison's formal structures and objectives. And so it has left us with unanswered questions about how and why individuals seek for creativity and expression in custodial settings in the first place. In addition, evaluation of these kinds of arts programs in prison has tended to be approached uncritically, lacking holistic engagement with the broader context that constitutes what is arguably a complex relationship between the arts and punishment. And this has meant that studies and evaluation of arts in prison have tended to perform a kind of decorative justice, as Heliotis has said, where the medium of the art, and through the medium of the art, prison is presented as a benevolent space, masking its injustices and painful effects, which may actually be the main driving forces for pursuing artistic expression in custody in the first place. What's more, and this is kind of where Heliotis' critique also continues, through these types of pretenses, we might say, prisoners' rehabilitation becomes a ticking box exercise, where they are trapped in what Pierre Bourdieu would term cultural goodwill, whereas they grow familiar with and appreciative of the hierarchy of symbolic goods in the artistic field. they are safely denied access to the practical means of attaining the most desirable standards of artistic expression. In this sense, those critical of the arts in prison efforts have challenged the extent to which such programs can actually empower through rehabilitation, enabling autonomy and enhancing self-esteem, and instead highlight that in their practical operationalization, many of these programs can be said to furnish precisely the opposite function of that of empowerment. But focusing on mainly on those rehabilitational therapy-based arts programs in prisons, regardless of their outcomes and rationales, I would say also risks casting the role of the arts in prisons as something that happens only or primarily in classrooms and group circles in prison. It also risks taking a top-down perspective into the study of prison arts, seeing them as practices facilitated by prison authorities and their links to external actors in the voluntary sector. In reality, prison artists have faced several obstacles from the authorities to perform their artistic practices, and much of prison art happens not because of, but in spite of the prison authorities' coercive and controlling gaze. As Nicole Fleetwood in her recent book on visual arts in American prisons, she notes much, if not most of art in prisons, however endorsed in classrooms, takes place in prison cells. And that's kind of the direction I'm also interested in taking this project. I'm interested in looking at the individual artistic efforts taking place in prisons that kind of go beyond the organized arts-based programs available in different prisons. But before I get into those, I want to jump very quickly to look at how this arts-prison relationship has been approached on the other side of this debate in the arts disciplines. Now, I'm not an arts person. I don't have a background in the arts, so many of my observations here might be perhaps a little bit unfinished. But what's kind of clear in the arts literature and in the history of art kind of literature that I've looked at so far is that there is an acceptance that there is indeed a relationship between the arts and places of incapacitation. So the idea, especially that social distancing, captivity, and restraint, that these ideas enable for creative and poetic and expressive thought and practices is fairly established in this type of literature. And there are several examples of art historians tracing recognition of this kind of idea, even in 12th century writings among religious abbots, or in the 16th century literature, as well as in the 19th and 20th century philosophies of various political writers. As Cusack notes, arts and corrections predate many of the more recent organizational efforts of prison regimes to provide arts education and therapy. And echoing others, he identifies several examples in our history of different types of artists, as we might term them, who were impacted by their imprisonment and whose artwork was also impacted by their imprisonment. So he knows examples from Plato to Socrates to the gladiators in Pompeii who graffitied their experiences, or the very many prisoners in Nazi and other concentration camps who risked their lives creating drawings as a way to escape their tragic circumstances and as means to bear witness to their experiences. So historically speaking, there is good reason to accept the links between captivity, isolation, and artistic expression. And this has been particularly recognized in political and literary writing that has emerged in penal context, and where some of the most renowned writers and political activists have been incarcerated. So examples include Oscar Wilde, Antonio Gramsci, Martin Luther King Jr., Primo Levi, as well as Angela Davis, among many others. And of course, it's not just in writing. Many famous musicians created while imprisoned, including Johnny Cash, Lil Wayne, Prodigy. And though less explored in the historical literature, there are also some examples of visual artists who created while in prison or in asylums, and most famously, Egon Schiele and Vincent van Gogh. So it seems that among the more affluent classes today, we have also come to accept that creative processes like writing or other art forms require periods of what we term as self-incarceration, as well as discipline akin to the bootcamp type of writing retreats that are increasingly very popular, especially in academia. So this imposed or self-imposed isolation is seen as necessary in order to enable free expression and uninterrupted thought. And as suggested by several media outlets in recent months, even our lockdown experiences during this pandemic may serve as another example of how we as a society, we have placed intimate links between this notion of isolation and creativity. So during the past few months, we have apparently, according to these reports, resorted to art in order to help deal with the monotony, isolation, and anxieties of our times, and in order to heal and communicate within this very new, for many of us, restrictive circumstances. So at least among those who practice art and those who have considered the elements of this creative process, it has long been accepted that while art is social, so while it seeks to communicate and share, its creation often needs distance and silence. Arguably recognition that has that there is a link between art and isolation has also meant that there is some recognition of the links there between art and incarceration. But as I argue here, this relationship between art and incarceration specifically has been relatively under-theorized. So for example, I mean, and this is obviously just an anecdote, but I think it's an interesting one as it, I think, positions the understanding of prison arts among the arts world in quite an interesting way. So in a recent piece at the Tate Modern's Talking Points section called Making Art in Isolation, and this is their latest publication from the end of January 2021, they write in this piece about the urge to create under lockdown conditions. And the piece assumes an obvious kind of link there between isolation and creativity. But more importantly, by tracing the experiences of artists in the past and present who worked under conditions of isolation, in this piece, rather provocatively, they mention, and I've put the quote there on the slide, to find inspiration whilst in quarantine, we can look to artists who have created art while imprisoned. Taking thus a rather loose conceptualization of isolation, this article mentions, among others, Kusan Kara Mustafa, who was imprisoned in Turkey after the military coup of 1971, Malakandana Nuneya, who was incarcerated in 1964 as a political prisoner involved in the Liberation Front for Mozambique's independence from Portugal, and French artist Boris Dasliski, who was sent to a concentration camp during the Second World War. So these prison artists and the art that they have created are presented in this piece and in several similar kind of formal discussions in the art world as being art products created as the result of isolation. So the effects and the role of punishment on the art and on the artists are sparsely mentioned, and punishment's relevance to both the art products and the affective process enabling creativity in such context is clearly neglected. So isolation in these curations is, I would say, fetishized, and not enough attention is actually paid to the very particular conditions of isolation under punishment. So lockdown isolations at home are obviously very different to prison isolation experiences, and the differences there are not reflected on in many of these discussions. There is also another issue in how prison art is represented. There is, I would say, a misrepresentation of who the prisoner artist is. Many of these formal kind of venues and galleries will present in their discussion the prisoner artists as primarily a political prisoner, ignoring therefore the thousands of other prisoners engaging in arts who may have committed very common rather than fetishized crimes. There is also a difference in many of the discussions and engagements that this spaces and platforms like the Tate will engage in relation to the prison arts, because they will tend to focus on artists who entered prison with the cultural capital to do art, rather than look at artists who discover art in prison because of their incapacitation. So all of these exclusions mean to me that so far this prisoner-art relation has been very eclectically explored. So to my knowledge, this piece that I've just mentioned from the Tate's talking point is actually the only one that I could identify where a formal platform like the Tate actually talks about the relationship between arts and imprisonment. As I gather, this is a fairly common omission among several large-scale exhibition, curation, and fine arts outlets, at least in the UK. And while there's a relative acceptance that incarceration and isolation have affected the lives of several renowned artists in art history, and while there is also recognition of the fact that prison conditions like those found in detention centers, concentration camps, and contemporary prisons make the presence of arts in these spaces almost inevitable, prison art as a genre has received considerably little art space analytic attention. So there are, of course, many sociological explanations for this. One of this is probably that much of what could constitute prison art today does not fit the remit of so-called high art. Its creators' backgrounds and impoverished and socially excluded life worlds rarely reach those with the most cultural capital in this arts arena. The invisibility of prison art is also another reason for the relative absence in the history of art as narrated in these established arts institutions. So as Nicole Fleetwood has warned, such mainstream institutions rarely represent a wide range of the arts practices in any given historical period. She explains that prison art exists in relation to economies, power structures, governing resources and access, and discourses that legitimate certain works as art, others as craft, material object, historical artifacts, or trash. Thus, in unpacking the relationship between the arts and punishment, in historically positioning art in prisons as a genre, it's crucial to consider the role of artistic and cultural capital in defining art and in delineating its contours. So in the rest of the paper, I will make an attempt to think a little bit about how we might theorize this relationship between arts and imprisonment. And I want to start off by posing a rather simplistic and basic idea, but I think it's an important one for this discussion, which is that I think both art and punishment draw on and inspire the desire to express in particular oneself. So the experience of art production and of the creative process more generally, as well as the experience of punishment, probably elucidate rather opposite emotions. So the former enables a sense of confidence, we might say, of freedom, autonomy, and you might derive feelings of fulfillment, productivity, and often gives a sense of purpose or serenity even to the artist. Punishment's experience, on the other hand, has been described as dull, empty, painful, and permeated by a constant sense of loss, or a loss of control, a loss of autonomy, of freedom and choice, and often a loss of self as well. So it's perhaps in these affective experiences of pain and loss where we can locate why art in prison is a desired good. Arguably, art in prison then may end up having a type of consumptive or addictive even power, and it is something to do in order to survive daily life. This power of art in prison can potentially define prisoner relations, their overall engagements with the space of the prison, and it can particularly affect their relationship with the authorities of the prison, who are often in a position to enable or disable access to opportunities to do art. So it's for this reason that it is fairly common to see in various arts programs evaluation reports that many prisoners certainly express that they need to do art rather than desiring to do it out of some kind of curiosity. It is also for the same reason that art poses a risk in prison, working, as Heliotis has noted, in the interest of punitiveness, and it's being often co-opted in the running of disciplining prisons. For example, time and again, arts providers will report in these evaluation reports that prison authorities will use their power to determine who gets to get access to art supplies or activities, and will often choose to punish individuals by excluding them from such programs. So it being a desired good, the arts seemingly empower officers in extending their power for hostility, and in so doing can potentially add to the pains of imprisonment. So to recognize, and I pose here that I think the foundation of a theory on the relationship between the arts and punishment is founded on their common, embodied and affective nature, as I call it. So the embodied nature of prison art is an important feature, I think, of this particular type of genre of art, as of course it is a feature of the arts in general. But the effects of imprisonment and their experience being embodied, I would say, mean that the body is of central importance to the production and the content of prison art. Examples of these range from prison art being expressed in tattoos in earlier decades, to the themes and focus on the corporal as well as the sexual in much contemporary prison art, as well as the popularity of drama and dance courses in custody. All of these, I think, are ways to illustrate the centrality of the bodies in the aesthetics of prison art. But also, this goes perhaps in some way in explaining to us the motives, the incentives behind the pursuit of prison arts in custody in particular. So the reliance of art on embodied expression, that is, forms of creative expression and enactment that go beyond cognitive practices and rationales, and rely on bodily and affective perception that might prioritize, for instance, physical work to craft, paint, play music, dance, or perform drama, for example, mean that the medium of the arts does something for the embodied prisoner, their identities and their emotions. Art is not selected by prisoners arbitrarily, in other words. Its intersubjective nature means that through art, the prisoner can communicate in means much more accessible and important to them, particularly in coercive spaces like the prison. They can, for example, use sound, colors, shape, movement, or symbolism, as well as abstract ideas, to share complex experiences that are often difficult to articulate discursively. And this is something that has that I had to really deal with in my previous research in prisons as well, which is another reason why I became interested in the arts as a potential form of methodology as well. So this kind of focus on the arts can paint an affective and subjective picture of these prison experiences. And through this, prisoners are also seeking to cope with these experiences and potentially escape them. As research has suggested, the power of art to offer a sense of escape from daily pains in custody is one of the main reasons prisoners will report resorting to it. So this creative form of escape is obviously liberating, as it draws heavily from the very little resources often available, physically speaking, to the prisoners, but also it relies on the power of imagination to transcend everyday obstacles. So here I focus on the hypothesis then that the experience of imprisonment inspires, motivates, and often necessitates the expression of oneself through the arts, and argue that a theory of art and punishment ought to focus on the substantive link between the two, being the lived experience and expression and the need to perhaps express pain specifically. To that end, and as Nicole Fleetwood has also argued, the prison arts have a central role to play in discussions of coping and survival in prison. So underscoring this embodied foundation of prison art also alerts us to another element of this theoretical discussion, the identities of prison artists. The questions of who are these prison artists and how they are created, how do they come to identify with their specific art form, can arguably offer much insight into a broader sociology of this prison art. And embodiment, again, as a perspective, is well suited to enable a biographic understanding of prison artists, inquiring into one's sense of self as gendered, sex, racialized, class, physically able or not. All of this can craft a more complex understanding of identities in penal context. So going beyond the stereotype then of the suffering, tragic artist, but also being attuned to the inequalities of the outside art world, infiltrating the art world of prisons, I mean, it's important, I would say, to avoid, for instance, a focus on the kind of the most celebrated artists that emerge, especially out of the most renowned arts programs available. So it's important to go beyond those white male artists or those who have very specific arts backgrounds prior to their imprisonment, or who may enjoy particular acceptability because of the specific messages in their work. And therefore, it's important to seek to look for prison artists beyond this established formal narratives and encourage through an exercise that is more sociological rather than aesthetic, perhaps, an intersectional perspective into who are those prison artists who are perhaps creating mostly in their prison cells, if not so much in prison classrooms. So the second element to this theory that I'm trying to kind of put together on the relationship between arts and prison seeks to consider the implications of this relationship, basically, and seeks to think how we might craft a theory that is, on the one hand, acknowledging the promise of the prison arts, but is also realistic in relation to how the prison arts are affected by the various structures and powers in which they operate in the prison context. So over the past few years, we have witnessed, especially in the US, I would say, an interesting proliferation of interest in prison arts, performed mainly, increasingly, let's say, by less mainstream art groups. This has been especially the case in galleries in large urban centers in the US, which have sought to present the work of artists in part as part of larger reformist kind of projects. Yeah, so these efforts hope to raise public awareness about prison conditions and the harms of punishment. And even recent examples include exhibits in the Museum of Modern Art and the Drawing Center in New York. So while giving visibility and color to this otherwise invisible or dark world of the prison, these projects have also been criticized, especially in the US context, but increasingly in the UK context as well, for engaging in the long history of commodifying prison art, which has its legacies in prison facilities themselves. So for example, San Quentin State Prison operates its own gift shop, selling prison art for prisoners on death row. Questions of authorship, therefore, proper financial compensation and recognition for the artistic pieces installed in these galleries, as well as questions around how the artists are caricatured in some of these exhibits, cast doubt on the potential for such projects to work in the interest of decarceration and social justice efforts. More than that, the financial backing behind some of these curations, particularly in the US context, is also being directly linked back to the prison industrial complex, where donors and funders of certain arts spaces exhibiting prison art have been directly linked to private security companies and the pharmaceutical industry. So these financial incentives complicate the role, arguably, of the arts in promoting efforts and in seeing them as politically viable in promoting efforts for challenging mass incarceration. So understanding the sociological appeal of prison art alerts us both to its promise and its risks. On the one hand, the themes of prison art are political and sociologically worthy of better exploration. On the other, the structures of power, coercion, and the fundamental inequalities involved in the making of art in carceral contexts mean that these power dynamics cannot be ignored when thinking about the meaning, the message, and the themes of the art. Perhaps more provocatively, a critical investigation into these prison arts ought then to consider issues of authenticity in the genre and explore to what extent prison art speaks more to a specific audience rather than it sincerely expresses the artist's inner world, their experiences, or even coping strategies. And if there are political, personal, or other incentives involved in making particular types of prison art over others, or in communicating only particular messages and drawing on mainly established narratives and symbols, what does this suggest about the aesthetic power of prison art and its representation of the artist? And what does it say about its emancipatory potential? But I want to remain relatively optimistic in my approach in all this. So notwithstanding these complexities and risks, for me at least, prison art has a clear sociological kind of aesthetic in terms of its content and in the way that it is produced. And therefore, it has a political promise for challenging some of our punitive and carceral attitudes. Many of the most likely publics of prison art, beyond those official representatives of the state who might just consume this art as part of their occupation, are what Marxson would call subaltern counterpublics, including, for instance, unions, students, therapeutic communities, feminists, minorities, activists, or community artists, and other community organizers. So although by no means a homogeneous group, these counterpublics can probably play an important role in giving prison art a necessary space in the community arts arena, and can therefore potentially promote a message that can enable prison arts to travel beyond prison walls and also potentially beyond criminalized communities. So art poses not only a sense of affective universality that has the potential to invoke empathy, as I said in the beginning of this talk, but it probably also occupies a perceived neutral space in our social lives, which enables the arts then to tap onto spectators that are less politically active and less engaged with issues of carceral justice. It can potentially change aspects driving punitive attitudes precisely because it is a middle-class endeavor to love art and to want to see art. So while issues of representation may highlight how the portrayal of prison arts may deny due recognition and often respect for prisoner artists themselves, the political potential of this essentialist treatment may ironically conceal opportunities to touch the sentiments of arts audiences who variably have the power to actually promote practical and real change. So it is by engaging in this form of strategic essentialism, as Spivak would call it, that we can begin to explore the promise of artistic practice by prisoners to art and contribute to the potential of these groups for social transformation. Here then the theory of prison arts moves beyond the driving forces for why art is produced in prisons and considers what prison art can substantively do, if not for the artists, for their communities and their audiences. In this sense, I conceptualize art as being both an unintended part of modern punishment, as well as acting potentially as an important antidote to it. As part of the, how am I doing for time, Ian?
You're at 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll try and wrap it up then, because, yeah. Okay. So part of my interest in looking at the implications of this relationship, also want to see how we might think about how we might use the prison arts as potential methodological tools. So here I'm interested in engaging in the opportunities to do what Bach and Bouvard would call a life sociology, and I'm interested to see the potential this kind of life sociology has for prison studies, as well as the critical potential that the arts as mediums can pose in relation to recent discussions in visual and narrative criminology. There are lots of interesting opportunities obviously posed by the prison arts, but again, on a methodological level, there are also risks and obstacles to consider. Obviously, criminology itself has a dark history in relation to using arts as forms of data. Famously, Lombroso was one of our so-called fathers of criminology, has used in his work prison graffiti and sculpture in order to gain insights into what he called prison types. So we ought to be careful about how we read prison art and what kinds of knowledge and tools we employ in order to do this. And my argument here, and that's part of the conclusion I draw as well, is that a way to move forward is that actually this is a relationship that we can't properly unpack purely from a sociological point of view or purely from an arts point of view. We need a more interdisciplinary perspective. Here I put a couple of reflections on how these methodological issues posed by prison arts also relate to how the arts, prison arts are represented in society, and especially how they pose certain issues of visibility. As I said earlier, I'm interested in identifying ways of looking at prison artifacts, of those less celebrated artists, of those less representative artists, and identifying ways to do that is perhaps the main challenge that I think I will be facing in this project. But to conclude, I'm just going to jump to the conclusion as I've probably talked for too long. What I kind of wanted to do in the paper is identify, first of all, the broader context through which we might begin to understand the relationship between prison and the arts. And I argue that that's actually a really important relationship to pay closer attention to and to actually theorize, particularly because an under-theorizing of this relation means that we either end up focusing primarily on those arts programs available through the prison authorities and therefore neglect the individual artists' efforts that are happening behind the scenes, or we might kind of fetishize the prison art relation and assume that it represents only some particular artists and not others, as we have seen being done mostly on the art side of this debate. And to finish off then, the symbiotic relationship between the arts and prison, as I called it, is basically founded upon the two of them being essentially contradictory phenomena that depend on channeling the lived experience of pain. So for me, this is it's a painful symbiosis between the arts and punishment. But the origins of this relationship can be understood in relation to a more closely embodied and effective account of both the prison and the arts. But the implications of this relationship arguably need a much more realist and structurally aware perspective that's focusing both on the potential promise of the arts to emancipate and act politically, but also remains conscious of the relatively dark history that the arts have in this sector and the potential risks that they pose. So I'll finish off here. Thank you for going over. Sorry for going over time, and thank you for listening.